Hello, my name is Stella Burnett, and this is my zero waste journey. So, I started by taking a piece of fabric and cutting and draping it on this little mannequin form. This was to allow me to get some ideas of some shapes and how pieces would fit together when using a basically just a rectangle piece of fabric. I was able to experiment a lot and get a great understanding of how things would fit and form to the body when using basically just that rectangular piece of fabric. This was my initial sketch that I made before I even started drafting a pattern. I knew I wanted to create something that looked like this, and this was easy for me to reference when it was time to create the pattern. My first step was to create a mini pattern. I started by taking a small piece of fabric and tracing basic shapes that would represent my garment. I would sew them together to see how it would fit. From there, I transferred it onto a piece of paper to get a general idea of how the pattern pieces would lay together. That helped me when it was time to construct my life-size pattern. I used my mini paper pattern as a reference and a guide for when it was time to construct the actual pattern. I did no previous measurements in my mini paper pattern. That was all done in the life size version. Here are all of the life-size pattern pieces placed together in one long horizontal strip. Next, I went to lay it on my fabric and found that it would not fit in the correct direction, so I had to cut down center front and stack them on top of each other. This was so I can attain that stretch across the body. Now my next step was to pin down all of my pattern pieces and cut them out. One thing that I learned from Project One is that I wanted to create all of my pattern pieces for both front and back and lay them all out on my fabric. That way I know exactly how much fabric I am using and where things need to be placed. On to the next step, which is construction. I started by basting the shoulder seams, side seams with the side inserts, and the sleeves together just so I can see exactly how it was going to look on a body. I'm unripping my basting stitch around the armhole on one of my sleeves because when I designed this pattern, I have a pretty well-rounded idea of how it's going to fit, but I wanted to put it together like all the way complete and see how it's actually going to look on a human body. So I'll put it on, and since I base stitch it, I can easily rip it. So I basted all of the important seams together with my regular sewing machine, and now I'm going to go through and serge them all so the finish is clean and neat and it won't unravel. Before starting, I ran some testing stitches to make sure that my settings were properly set on my serger before actually starting on my garment. After I did that, I started by overlocking the center front and center back seams. Then I moved to serging around the neck hole. From there, I seamed rip down near the hem so I could then overlock the hem of the garment, which would allow for a clean finish. After overlocking the hem, I was able to turn it under and officially finish the hem with a zigzag stitch. That brought me to overlocking the side seams and the inserts. My next step was to focus on the sleeves. I first started by seam ripping near the sleeve opening with that basting stitch. I then overlocked around the sleeve opening, which led me to basically do what I did to the hem. I turned it under and finished with a zigzag stitch around that sleeve opening. Then I basted the sleeves back onto the bodice. I overlocked the sleeves to the bodice after making sure the fit was correct. From there, I finished around the neck hole by turning the overlock stitch under and performing a zigzag top stitch. After completing the hem at the bottom of the bodice, around the sleeves, and finishing the neckline, it was time to figure out the detail that I wanted to include within the sleeve. I knew I wanted to create a draped sleeve, which led me to adding pleats down that top seam on the sleeve. After I added the pleats, I had a completed zero waist top. For my overlay dress garment, I wanted to experiment with the method of subtraction cutting. This starts by folding my fabric in half and making sure the grain lines match up on both sides of the fabric. I then measured the length and width of the piece of fabric that I would be working with, and from there I was able to decide where to cut. So that just took some measurements and I used my rulers to draw guidelines from where I was going to cut. The next step was really scary for me. This is where I decided to cut. Having Julian Roberts' mentality, who was a huge inspiration for this subtraction cutting method, I just had to go with the flow, do it, and if I made a mistake, I was just going to have to work with it. This is the finished outcome of my subtraction cutting, and on to figuring out what I'm going to do with the pockets, which I was going to use that extra fabric that I cut off. Here I am placing and pinning and deciding how I want my pockets to look. Here is what I came up with. My next step was to start the construction of the dress. I started by overlocking the top of the dress. From there, I went and I started to make the loops for the lobster clasp to be attached to. I made these loops out of the selvage of the fabric that I cut off that was near the hem. I knew this would be perfect use of this extra fabric that would essentially just be turned into waste if I didn't have a usage for them. Now before adding the loop with the lobster clasp to the dress, I wanted to finish around the top. So I turned the overlock stitch under and I finished with a zigzag top stitch. After finishing the top of the dress on both front and back sides, I added the loop with the lobster clasp to the front and back of the dress. This was done by just performing a regular top stitch. My next step was to baste the side seams together. This was to allow me to see how high up I want the slits to go on both sides of the dress. After basting the side seams together, I put my dress overlay on the form to decide where I was going to place the pockets. Since my garment was already on the form, I decided to make my straps for the dress. I used a light chain that I had previously bought at Joann's, and I used a couple tools to pry them apart and make sure the length was exactly what I needed. I noticed that I needed to take the sides of the dress in a little bit, so first I marked where I wanted my pocket to lay, and then I started adding some pleats on both sides of the side seam. To finish the construction of the overlay dress, I overlocked around both of the pocket edges. Before adding the pockets to the dress, I pressed the pocket overlock edge to the wrong side to make sure that it was nice and smooth and easy to sew on. Here I am ripping the basting stitches on the side seams, so then I could go ahead and overlock each side seam individually. This is going to help me in the process of finishing the slits down at the bottom of the dress. After overlocking each side seam individually, it was time to sew them together with a regular stitch. After sewing the side seams together, I added 2-inch pleats on each side of the side seams. I then pressed the side seams open and finished with securing them down with a zigzag top stitch. I was able to continue this down to the slits so the slits were nice and clean. I then marked where I wanted the pockets to be on both sides and I top stitched them down. The last step in finishing the overlaid dress was to overlock the bottom of the dress and press it and turn it under to perform a zigzag top stitch to finish the hem. And there you have it. That is how I constructed my zero waist garment, and this is the amount of wastage that I was left with. Some of this includes some selvage and some testing strips. Let's take a look of the final outcome. Here is a photograph of the front of the look, the left side of the look, the back of the look, and the right side. A detail shot of the sleeve, detail shot of the lobster clasp and chain, and a detail shot of the pockets. The end, and I hope you enjoyed my zero waste documentation.